Thank you, Reverend Aaron. I have a BFF, a best friend forever, and his name is Jonathan. And Jonathan is a Canadian. Now, you know the definition of a Canadian. A Canadian can be defined as an unarmed American who has health insurance. Now, Jonathan is a dear, sweet guy, kind, compassionate. He's all that, except, and this is a big exception, except when you go to a hockey game with him. I don't know what it is with my Canadian friends. You go to a hockey game with them, and this Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde thing takes place. When you go to a hockey game with Canadians, you are swimming with the piranhas, if you don't mind my mixed metaphor. I was in Canada one time, and I'm surrounded by these Canadian hockey fans in the stand, and I'm looking around, and my goodness, I almost expected them to start chanting, "Give us Barabbas! Give us Barabbas!" Well, anyway, Jonathan walked up to me, it must have been around 2 years ago, around this time of year as we were approaching Thanksgiving, and he said to me, "You know, Rick, the way you Americans celebrate holidays, I have to tell you, I think American Thanksgiving is my favorite holiday." And I said, "What do you mean, Jonathan?" He said, "Rick, the way you Americans celebrate holidays, you're either spending a boatload of money, or your teeth are rotting out from the sugar, or something explodes in your face. I mean, Thanksgiving's really different." And I'd agree with him. Thanksgiving really is different and special. I have so many wonderful memories of Thanksgiving, as I'm sure you do too. I remember growing up in my hometown, and the night before Thanksgiving, my hometown held a community Thanksgiving service. All the churches and the synagogues got together to hold one service. It was beautiful. And I recently called my hometown to find out whether this was still the case, and they said yes, only now it's not only the churches and synagogues, it's the local sangha, the local habirot, the local ashram, and the local mosque are now all participating. I remember Thanksgiving Day growing up. My small nuclear family would go off and join the larger clan, and we'd go to Uncle Larry and Auntie Adeline's house. And Auntie Adeline was a fantastic cook, but more importantly, Aunt Adeline played a mean piano. And after dinner, she'd have us all around the table, and we'd be singing in 4-part harmony, do, a deer, a female deer. It was, and again, remember, I came from a Jewish family, so she also had us do a rousing rendition of "It's Beginning to Look a Lot Like Hanukkah." Seriously, have you ever stopped and wondered how many of the Christmas songs were written by Jews? I'm seriously, Irving Berlin and something. Think about it a moment. I remember, fast forward some more. I remember, my son Michael. He's now head and shoulders taller than me, but in those days, thank goodness, he was little Michael. I remember little Michael coming to the table, dressed up in his pilgrim costume, and his little sister Catherine in her Indian outfit. Fast forward some more, I remember one Thanksgiving weekend, and we lived outside Washington, D.C., and it was wall-to-wall traffic on the Capitol Beltway. Nothing was moving. I think it was a Redskins game, and Gorbachev was in town or something like. It was not moving, and everybody's screaming and getting nasty. My wife, Debbie, takes out a piece of paper and a pen and says, "We're writing a gratitude list." And so we just went back and forth about things that we were grateful for. We were over 45 minutes, and at the end of that 45 minutes, nothing outside had changed. I mean, people were still honking and nothing was moving, but we felt such an attitude of gratitude. I mean, our car was really a Thanksgiving mobile. Fast forward some more. I remember when Rachel, our daughter Rachel, was a little younger than several years younger than she is now, and we had our family reading, and I remember we read to her about the Thanksgiving story, and recently I found one of the books we read to her. This was one of the books we read to her about Thanksgiving. And it's only a children's book, but I remember in reading this book, the character that really stood out for me was Squanto. I mean, Squanto was the Indian who befriended the Pilgrims. And many leading historians, modern historians, say if it were not for Squanto, it probably would have been really problematic whether the Pilgrims would have made it, whether they would have survived. Now look, I know you know the Thanksgiving story, but you know what? Sometimes really important stories bear repeating. Let's remind ourselves. The Pilgrims were religious dissidents from the late 1500s, early 1600s. In British society of that day, they called them nonconformists. They were in London and Manchester, and things got pretty dicey for them. They left England, they went over to Holland, where things were a little freer, but still, things got dicey for them. They left, they got a great idea. Here was their plan. They're going to sail for the New World. They're going to settle in the colony of Virginia. They won't settle in Jamestown or one of the major cities, but they'll go out a little way so they can be a little bit separate. But believe me, the last thing in the world they wanted to do was be completely isolated. So they got onto the Mayflower and started to sail to the New World. I love that old saying, you know, if you want to make God laugh, tell him your long-run plans. And as you know, remember, a big wind, a storm blew them way off course, and they wound up north of Virginia, way north of Virginia, in what became New England. Now, I hope I'm not offending any New Englanders here. I love New England and all that. But think about New England last winter. Remember New England getting pounded snowstorm after snowstorm after snowstorm. I mean, think about going through that kind of winter in the early 1600s when what was wilderness without 21st century technology. And the other thing which I think a lot of times gets lost in telling, you know, when we think about the Pilgrims, is how few of them knew anything about agriculture. Modern historians say that probably of all the Pilgrims, probably 4 or 5 of them were farmers. Maybe 6 or 7 if you're willing to stretch the definition of what a farmer is. Most of the Pilgrims knew next to nothing about farming. As an indication of this, there was not one, count it, not one plow on the Mayflower. I mean, how'd you like to land on the rocky soil of New England in the early 1600s and you don't even have a single plow? And I think sort of representative of their, their agricultural lack of prowess was the great pea fiasco. They had some pea seeds, but this was a strain of peas which was right for England. It wasn't right for New England. And they looked up in the British Almanac when you should plant them. Well, maybe this was the time you should plant these seeds in Britain, but it surely wasn't the time you plant these seeds in New England. And it was an absolute disaster. During the first winter, over 50% of the Pilgrims died. During the height of the winter, they were dropping dead at a rate of 3 per day. Now, in modern Virginia, a lot of times what we Virginians do is we go to the Carolina beaches in the summer, and there is an open-air theater. They've been doing this show, I think, for eons, forever and ever. And it's called The Lost Colony of the Carolinas. It's about Sir Walter Raleigh's colony he tried to found, and it just totally vanished. If a few things had gone a little differently, we could very easily be talking about the lost colony of New England. Now, it wasn't that the Pilgrims weren't trying. They were doing their best. They were doing their best, but they were constantly failing. Finally, things got really desperate. And at that point, they realized there wasn't going to be any rescue mission from the old world. As far as the old world was concerned, when the Pilgrims set sail for the New World, good riddance. It was just them and the elements. And they weren't doing too well. And then one day, a few of the Pilgrims were on the beach. And they saw coming towards them this Indian, this Native American. And this Native American was making the signs, the universal signs of peace. Now this was weird to them, because the deal was the Indians stayed over there, we stay over here, they stay low profile, we stay low profile, we don't mix. That was fine as far as the Pilgrims were concerned. We have enough problems without dealing with Indians. But here comes an Indian making peace signs. And if that weren't strange enough, when the Indian comes over, he starts talking in perfect English. I mean, this is New England of the 1600s, wilderness, and an Indian comes up to you and he starts talking perfect English. That was Squanto. Could I put this in modern context? Suppose you were on a Martian expedition. You were on an expedition to Mars. And you were supposed to land in a pretty hospitable part of Mars, but something happens, and your capsule comes down in a pretty inhospitable part of Mars. And your crew is dying. And you know there is not enough time for a rescue mission from Earth. And then one day you're on the dunes of Mars, and you see this green Martian coming towards you. And this green Martian is making the universal signs of peace. Now, if this weren't breathtaking enough, you're looking and you can't believe your eyes, because on the head of the Martian is a Kansas City Royals baseball cap. And when the Martian gets even to you, the first words out of this Martian's mouth are, "I love Hosmer and Moustakis." That's what the Pilgrims went through. Squanto taught these pilgrims how to farm. He taught them how to fish. He taught them how to hunt, and he taught them how to do agriculture. And most importantly, Squanto taught the pilgrims how to get along with their Indian neighbors. Now, Winston Churchill, during the worst part of the World War II era, said, "You can always count on the Americans to do the right thing after the Americans have tried all the other alternatives and failed." Well, the Pilgrims tried all the other alternatives and failed. And when they did, along came Squanto. Now, the great Swiss psychologist Carl Jung, the great modern mythologist from America, Joseph Campbell, Jung and Campbell mean an awful lot to me. And both Jung and Campbell write an awful lot about archetypes. And although there was a historical Squanto, it's clear that this is very much, Squanto is very much a representation of this archetype, the saving trickster. And all societies have this saving trickster archetype. For example, for a lot of Native American tribes, it was Kokopelli. It was Kokopelli. The common feature of this archetype, this trickster archetype, is a person or society faces what seems to be an insurmountable dilemma, and they're failing. Their egos are trying the worst way to solve this problem, and their best thinking and their best efforts can't get them out. And then when they are finally at their ropes, they let go. And when they let go, there is not an empty void, but there is a beyond. In comes the saving trickster. Myrtle Fillmore, co-founder of Unity, and she lived many years in the Wild West with Charles. And Myrtle Fillmore said that she felt that many of the Native Americans that she met in the Wild West were far closer to Christ consciousness, far closer to spirit than many of her Christian neighbors back east. Unity is based on several simple principles, and these principles work. However, and here's the big however, for these unity principles to work, you gotta work them. You know, that great humorist Mort Saul said he had bought a set of the world's great books, and he lined his libraries with the world's great books. He wasn't going to read them, but he said just having them there through osmosis, they would come into his mind. Unfortunately, it doesn't work that way. And then what happens to some of us, me included, is you go through a real crisis. Maybe it's a health challenge. Maybe it's a love relationship which breaks up. Maybe it's a family which breaks up. Maybe it's your corporation goes kaput, and you're facing what you at first looks like financial insecurity. Whatever it is, you go through a crisis, and you know what? These unity principles start looking pretty good. And you start working these unity principles. And you know what? When you do, along comes your Squanto. Now, this archetype, I mean, the Bible is just chock-a-block full of examples of this archetype. My favorite is the Israelites by the Red Sea. I mean, let's face it, the Israelites had tried in the worst way to be free from Egypt. And there's the Red Sea, there's the Promised Land right over there. It looks like it's a hop, skip, and a jump, and they're free. They look up, and again, I don't care whether you take these stories literally or metaphysically or some combination of the two. They look up, and coming at them is the Egyptian army, chariots and everything. And they realize it's just a matter of minutes, and all their best ego efforts are going to go up in smoke. They're going to be roadkill. And it's at that point that Moses stepped forward and said, "Fear not." Have you ever noticed that when angels or enlightened masters or prophets speak, oftentimes the first words out of their mouth are, "Fear not"? I believe that's because when we are in fear, lack, and scarcity mode, when we are in error thought, there is no way that we can be at the top of our spiritual game. Moses said, "Fear not. Stand firm and look to your deliverance this day." All you have to do is be still. And thank God for once in their lives, the Israelites read the label and followed the instructions. And the rest, as they say, was history. When everything else failed for the Israelites, along came their Squanto. One of my favorite stories from Islam is the story where Muhammad and his servant are in Mecca, when Mecca was still controlled by hostile forces to Muhammad. And there are thousands of these, enemy folks looking out and trying to get Muhammad. And if they get Muhammad, it's not going to be happy days are here again. Finally, Muhammad and his servant are reduced to hiding in a proverbial broom closet. And the servant looks at Muhammad and says, "This is an absolutely hopeless situation. There are thousands of them and only 2 of us." And Muhammad said, "No, there are 3 of us." And Muhammad pointed to heaven. And that very night, Muhammad and his servant found a way to safety. When all else failed, along came their Squanto. One of my favorite magazines is a magazine that was founded by Dr. Norman Vincent Peale. It's called Guideposts. It publishes true stories written by everyday folks, common, everyday folks. And one of the ones which they repeat the story, publish it several times, but you know what? Sometimes important stories bear repetition. The story was written by a woman who was a little girl in the 1930s, but, by now she's a grandmother. And the story takes place in the 1930s. And she said, "Our family was the only black family way down south that owned land." And that didn't sit well with the power structure of that day. And they wanted it in the worst way to reduce them back to sharecroppers. The family's mule died. The bank thought, "We got him now." They sent him a letter and said, if you have no plan to show how you're going to farm your land and make your payments by Friday, we're going to start repossessing the land. So the family gets together on Monday. They pray, and the father's leading the prayers and said, "Lord, you know our situation. Help us to get someone to loan us a mule." The father goes into town, searching out a mule, but believe me, the fix was on. The squeeze play was on. Nobody was loaning them a mule. They go, father comes back, the kids and everybody asks, "Did you get a mule?" "No." Tuesday, the same thing, prayer. "Lord, please help us to have a mule." They go to town, they come back, the father comes back, "Were you able to get a mule?" "No." Same thing happens Wednesday, same thing happens Thursday. Now we're down to Friday. Friday is crunch time. And they finally got around the table and the father said, "Lord, all week we have been praying for a mule, but today we're not going to pray for a mule. We're just going to turn this situation over to you and know that all is in divine order." The father went to town, came back, The kids gathered around him. "Daddy, were you able to get a mule?" And the father shook his head and said, "No, I was not able to get a mule. But come outside and see what I was able to get." They go outside, and there in the front yard is a shiny tractor. Somebody had loaned him a tractor. I mean, how many times have we been trying to shove a mule down God's throat when all along it has been God's good pleasure to give us a tractor? When all else failed, along came Squanto. Thousands of alcoholics, drug addicts, people with sexual addictions, people with eating disorders, gambling disorders, they have all tried to shake their addiction and have not been able to. Their best efforts have not been able to shake these addictions. And then they find 12-step fellowships. And they're willing to come into these 12-step fellowships and hit bottom. And they are willing to let go and let God. And then they find, as the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous puts it, that they have been rocketed to the fourth dimension. And they are now living happy, joyous, and free from the grips of their addiction. When all else failed, along came these addicts, Squanto. September 11th. We all know where we were September 11th. Now, it's reasonable, you guys, most people, when you think of September 11th, you think of New York City and the World Trade Center. We lived in Washington, and Debbie, my wife Debbie, was an employee with the Defense Department. So sometimes the first thing that comes to mind is the Pentagon. Remember, the Pentagon also got slammed. We got to know a lot of the folks who were in that part of the Pentagon that got slammed. And the stories which we heard of love and devotion, today's daily word was honor. This was honor in the highest sense. Stories of people running into the buildings to save people, not running out of these buildings. And the same thing was true in New York City at the World Trade Center. You didn't hear stories about people selfishly trying to claw their way out and claw over other people, but you did hear stories about total strangers carrying a man in a wheelchair down 92 flights of stairs, and you heard a lot of other stories like that. And we also saw with our own eyes police, fire, and emergency workers giving true love and service. Even when the towers come crumbling down, along comes Squanto. Now, I know some of you have heard this story before, but again, sometimes important stories bear repeating. A man dies. He goes to heaven, and he sees God. And he looks at God and he says, "There is so much suffering and misery on earth. Why didn't you do anything about it?" And God looked at the man and said, "But I did do something about it. I created you. I created you." This Thanksgiving, may we be more open to the Squantos in our life. And more importantly, may we become more like Squanto. But how can we do this? I mean, what practical steps, what can we do to be more like Squanto and open to more Squanto-like influences? I think a good way of starting is by looking at Squanto's life and learning the lessons from his life. Squanto was born into the Patuxet tribe, which in those days was part of the Wampanoag Confederacy. When Squanto was a young man, he was captured. You talk about X-Files and alien abductions. He was captured by a party of the English, put on a ship, and sent over to London. But as he was being sent over to London, the English saw something special in Squanto, and they got this idea. Let's teach Squanto. Let's teach him English. Let's let him be a go-between or an ambassador between us and the Indians. And so they taught Squanto. They put him on another ship and sent him back to the New World. But when Squanto came back to the New World, he was captured by another party of Englishmen and shipped this time back to the Old World, to Lisbon. And I think it's important to remember, when Squanto was making these transatlantic voyages, he wasn't exactly in a first-class cabin. He got to Lisbon. He came this close to being sold into slavery, as if what he was in already was not a vicious form of slavery. Through the Jesuits, he was able to get free. And then he was able to make his way to London. And from London, he was able to get back to the New World. Squanto went to the Patuxet region, went back to his village, and there he found his village was a ghost town. The overwhelming majority of his people had died in a plague that was captured, that they caught from the Europeans. Now, I think most people, if they had gone through half of what Squanto experienced, their reaction would be, I'm going to kill every one of those European devils I can get my hands on. But that was not Squanto's way. Now look, this was the 1600s. They didn't use these words back then. But it is clear that Squanto did his self-awareness work. Squanto did his shadow work. And Squanto did his forgiveness work. May we do the same. This is only a children's book, but I believe it has much to teach us. It reads, Squanto lived with the Pilgrims for the rest of his life. The Pilgrim children loved him and followed him everywhere. He taught them stories and Indian words. The children learned many things from Squanto. May we too learn many things from Squanto. And may the words of the ancient prophet Zechariah resonate in our hearts. It's not by might, nor by power, but by my Spirit, says the Lord. Thank you, and God bless. Thank you. Thank you. It's now time for our meditation. Let's take a deep breath in and slowly let it out. Let's take another deep breath in and slowly let it out. Let's close our eyes if we want to. Many times in this hustle-bustle, fast-paced world, we seem to be at the end of our rope. So many times, our long-run problems started out as our brilliant short-run solutions. But when we think that we are at the end of our rope, and that our frail egos are not going to save the day, it's at that point that we can, at long last, become teachable and let go and let Spirit. And as we do let go, we find that instead of just a void, there is a beyond that is within. And it's from this beyond that is within we can be overcomers. And so we say thank you. And gladly meet this presence as we go into the silence. Thank you, dear Spirit, for this beyond that is within. And as we go into this Thanksgiving, help us to be filled with an attitude of gratitude, and for the many opportunities not to live in the problem, but to be part of the solution. And for this and so much more, we say amen and amen.